Let us begin. Imagine, if you will, the world of medieval Europe. Not the painted world of fairy tales with glittering swords, shining armor, and gallant heroes riding through forests to rescue maidens. No, this is not that version. This is the slow, sometimes heavy, often tiring truth of how knights actually lived. The year might be around 1200, a time of castles that were cold, damp, and drafty, a time of villages that smelled of hay, wood smoke, and sometimes, rather unpleasantly, of unwashed bodies and animals. The Middle Ages were not glamorous. Life was, more often than not, routine, repetitive, and bound by duty. In fact, boredom itself was a large part of a knight's existence. A knight's journey did not begin with armor and sword. It began as a boy. Often, at the age of 7, a noble child was sent away from his family to serve as a page in another lord's household. Imagine a little boy, barely able to lift a wooden practice sword, leaving behind his mother, his siblings, his home. He would grow up in a castle that was not his own, learning manners, obedience, and the very basics of service. This is where the myth begins to break, because for many years the future knight's life looked far less like adventure and far more like housework. As a page, he would wake early, often before the sun rose. The castle would still be dim, lit only by torches or the faint light of dawn through narrow stone windows. The boy's first tasks were simple but humbling. He might carry messages. He might clean boots. He might hold basins of water so that the lord or lady of the castle could wash their hands. In the grand picture of history, these little duties seem invisible, but for the boy, they were everything. They were the slow foundation of discipline. And day after day, year after year, this quiet service prepared him for a future that might, only might, lead to knighthood. The castle itself, though fascinating to us today, was not a place of constant wonder. Most castles were cold in winter and hot in summer. They smelled of smoke from fireplaces and of food that had been stored for months. The stone walls echoed footsteps. The halls were often silent, except for the sounds of servants working or the dull thud of practice weapons in the training yard. For a child, there was little romance in it. Yes, sometimes there were celebrations, a feast perhaps, with music and laughter, but most days were plain: bread and stew for meals, water or watered-down ale to drink, a bed made of straw, a cloak to keep warm, and a routine that repeated itself with little change. After years as a page, usually around the age of 14, the boy would become a squire. This was the next stage, the stage where he served a knight directly. Again, the imagination tells us this must have been exciting, but in truth, it was mostly more work. The squire cared for the knight's horse, polished his armor, kept his weapons sharp, and made sure everything was in place.
Yes, the squire would train in combat. He would practice with wooden swords, learn to ride, and sometimes accompany his knight to battle or tournament. But even then, his role was often to stand at the edge, to carry supplies, to help his master dress for the event. And even in tournaments, where the crowd cheered and banners waved, The work behind the scenes was long, tiring, and not glamorous at all. So, when we speak of knights, we must remember their life was built on duty, patience, and service, not on constant adventure, not on shining heroics, but on years of learning how to serve, how to obey, and how to endure monotony. Think of the rhythm of a castle, morning bells calling people to prayer, the clatter of servants preparing food, the sounds of livestock, chickens, goats, horses, always nearby. Then long hours of chores. A squire would brush horses, feed them, clean the stables. He would polish a sword until it gleamed, though he himself rarely had time to shine. He would fetch water from wells, carry armor that was heavy even before a knight put it on, and sometimes simply stand and wait. Waiting was, in truth, one of the most common experiences. Waiting for the knight to call, waiting for the Lord to give orders, waiting for meals, waiting for news of battles that might or might not ever come. And in the waiting, time passed slowly. The days blurred together. The excitement of war or tournaments was rare. Weeks could go by without anything dramatic happening. The boy who dreamed of glory soon realized that most of his life would be filled with silence, discipline, and tasks that others might call boring. And yet, this was the reality that created knights. This was the soil in which their identity grew. Without the long hours of service, without the endless repetition of small duties, the knight would not have been ready for the rare moments when he was called to action. As you imagine this life, perhaps you can see the long stone hallways of a castle. Perhaps you can picture a young boy, barely a teenager, holding a candle while his master prays in the chapel. The candle flickers, the stone floor is cold beneath his feet, and he is tired, but he stands, because standing is what he has been told to do. This was the truth of knighthood, not a tale of constant adventure, but a path of slow preparation, of long patience. The glamour, if it ever came, was built on a foundation of quiet, uneventful days. And so, as you rest, think of that silence. The silence of the castle halls, the silence of nights when the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the distant call of an owl. A knight's life, in its truest form, was full of such silence. It is in that silence, in that slow, uneventful rhythm, that we begin our journey.
Let us continue our journey into the quiet world of the medieval knight. In the last session, we saw how a boy's path began as a page, serving quietly in the dim corridors of a lord's castle. His days were filled with errands, small chores, and silent lessons of patience. Now, as he grows older, usually around the age of 14, his path changes. The boy becomes a squire. Becoming a squire sounds like an exciting transformation. After all, this is the stage when he is directly attached to a knight, when he begins to train more seriously, to handle weapons, to ride horses, and to learn the arts of war. But as with all things in the real life of a knight, the glamour is far less than the myth. The squire's world was still mostly about service. His knight was his master, and every day began with attending to him. Imagine the sun rising slowly, its pale light slipping through narrow castle windows. The air is cold, and the castle stones seem to hold the chill of the night. The squire must wake before his knight, preparing his clothes, checking his armor, making sure the horse is fed and groomed. Armor itself was no simple matter. It was heavy, made of iron or steel, and it needed constant care. Rust could appear quickly if left unattended. A squire would spend long hours polishing breastplates, greaves, and helmets. He would oil the joints, make repairs to straps, and test buckles. This was not heroic work. It was, in truth, closer to the work of a servant or a craftsman. His reward was not praise, but simply the knowledge that he had done his duty and that his knight would be ready for the day. Horses, too, required endless attention. A knight without his horse was considered incomplete. The squire would brush the animal, check its hooves, feed it oats or hay, and walk it around the yard. He would also clean the stables, a task far less glamorous than the songs and poems suggest. The smell of straw and dung, the weight of buckets of water, and the dirt on his hands, these were as much a part of training as holding a sword. Still, slowly, between these chores, the squire did begin to learn the arts of combat. He practiced with wooden swords, striking again and again against posts, or sparring with other squires. His shield was heavy, his arm grew tired, but the repetition built strength. He learned to ride not only in calm moments, but while carrying weapons, balancing himself as he controlled a horse in motion. Archery, too, was part of his training. Though knights were not always archers themselves, it was useful to understand the bow, to aim at distant targets, to know what his fellow soldiers might face. Day after day, the routine was much the same. Wake early, tend to the knight's needs, polish armor, care for the horse, practice in the yard, assist in meals, and remain ready at all times. Some days brought variation, a tournament perhaps, or the arrival of visitors at the castle. But most days blurred into one another. The boy who had once dreamed of excitement often discovered that life as a squire was in truth repetitive and slow. And yet there were lessons in this slowness. To be a knight was not only to fight, it was to endure, to wait, to be patient in times of peace so that one could be steady in times of war. The endless polishing of armor was not simply about metal, it was about discipline. The care of horses was not only about animals, it was about responsibility. And the long hours of training, though dull, forged habits that would last a lifetime.
In the evenings, the squire might be allowed to sit in the great hall, watching as his knight and the lord of the castle spoke. He would not speak himself, unless spoken to, but he would observe. He would learn the manners of nobility, the codes of courtesy, the rituals of feasts. These were as important as combat, For a knight was expected to be more than a warrior. He was to be a figure of order, a representative of his lord, a man who lived by rules that others might follow. But again, the myth is greater than the reality. Feasts were not constant. Most meals were simple: bread, broth, perhaps a bit of cheese or salted meat. The great hall might echo with music and laughter on special occasions, but on most nights it was quiet, filled only with the sounds of chewing, the clatter of wooden bowls, the shuffle of servants' feet. And as night fell, the squire returned to his small chamber, often a shared space with other young men. He lay down on a straw mattress, pulling a rough blanket over himself, listening to the wind outside or the distant howl of dogs. The day was over, but tomorrow would be much the same. The path from squire to knight was long. It could take years, sometimes 7, sometimes more. And during that time, many squires never became knights at all. Some died in service. Some were injured. Some simply remained squires, serving faithfully but never rising higher. Only a few reached the moment of being knighted, the ceremony where a sword was laid upon their shoulders and they were declared men of honor. So, as you imagine the life of a squire, do not think only of shining armor or glorious tournaments. Think instead of the endless repetition of chores. Think of the quiet hours spent waiting, the sore arms from practice, the smell of horses, the flicker of candles in a stone hall. This was the reality. The slow, steady preparation that shaped a boy into something more. And as you rest now, think of that slow rhythm, the routine that never hurried, that carried on with patience, the sound of armor being polished, the soft breath of a horse in its stall, the faint prayers whispered in a chapel at night. These were the sounds that filled the life of a squire. Not the thunder of battles, not the cheers of crowds, but the simple, quiet, sometimes boring, truth of what it meant to live as a knight in training. And in that truth, there is a strange kind of peace. As the boy grows and years pass, some squires finally achieve the honor of knighthood. A sword is laid upon their shoulder, vows are spoken, and they are now considered men of rank. At last, the boy who once polished armor now wears his own. The boy who once served now leads. But even here, in this new stage of life, the glamour is not what the stories suggest. The daily life of a knight was not filled with constant adventure. It was not a string of battles or quests. It was instead a routine, an endless pattern of duties, responsibilities, and waiting. To live as a knight was to live within the slow rhythm of medieval society. Morning often began early. The first sound was the bell from the castle chapel, calling everyone to prayer. In the dim light of dawn, knights, squires, servants, and peasants alike moved about their tasks. For a knight, prayer was expected. Before armor, before horses, before weapons, there was a bowing of the head, a quiet chant, a murmur of words repeated day after day. After prayer came food, though meals were rarely grand. A knight might have bread, perhaps dipped in broth, maybe a bit of cheese and watered ale. Only on special days or during feasts was there meat, roasted and fragrant. Most mornings were plain and simple, enough to give strength for the day ahead, but never excessive. The knight's duties varied. Some days he trained. Training was necessary, for the skills of sword, shield, and lance could grow rusty if ignored. Imagine the dull clatter of wooden swords striking each other in a courtyard, the heavy breathing of men in padded tunics, the repeated motions of thrust and block, swing and parry. It was not always exciting. It was repetitive and often exhausting. Yet without repetition, there was no mastery. Other days, the knight served his lord in matters of the estate. He might attend a meeting in the great hall, listening as disputes were settled between peasants, or as taxes and harvests were discussed. The knight's presence was as much a symbol as a function. His very figure, standing tall in armor, reminded all present of the authority of the Lord. At times, the knight rode out across the lands, not to battle, but to oversee fields, to check roads, or to carry messages. These journeys were not heroic quests, but quiet tasks, moving slowly through countryside fields, past peasants bent over their work, past rivers and woods that offered no excitement, only the passing of time. Evenings might bring practice in jousting or archery, but more often they brought ordinary routine. A knight might eat again in the hall, speak briefly with his lord, and then retire to his chamber. His chamber was not always luxurious. Some knights had private rooms, yes, but even those were simple compared to what our modern imagination creates. A bed of wood, a mattress of straw or wool, a chest for clothes, a cloak to keep warm. Candles provided light, and sometimes smoke filled the room more than brightness. Life in the castle was not loud, not constantly festive. It was slow. The sounds were steady, the ringing of hammers in the smithy, the lowing of cattle, the footsteps in the hall, the occasional barking of dogs. The castle was alive, but not lively. Its rhythm was calm, almost monotonous.
Knights, of course, did fight battles, but battles were rare. Years might pass with no war. And in those years, what did a knight do? He waited. He trained. He served. He lived through countless days of ordinary tasks. The heroic songs of knights on endless quests were mostly inventions of poets and storytellers. Reality was quieter, slower, and far less dramatic. There was also the matter of care. Armor had to be maintained constantly. Even as a knight, he could not neglect this. Rust was always a threat. Horses, too, required daily attention. Even if the knight himself did not feed and brush them, his squires often did, he still oversaw their condition. His horse was his pride, and he could not allow it to weaken. Meals, again, were a marker of the day. Lunch, if we may call it that, was often bread and pottage, a thick soup of grains and vegetables. On rare occasions, a little salted meat. Dinner in the evening was larger, but still far simpler than feasts described in stories. Only great celebrations brought roasted boar, venison, or exotic spices. On most nights, the knight ate plainly, as did most people of his time. The evenings stretched long. Without books, since many knights could not read, entertainment was simple. Sometimes a minstrel sang, sometimes stories were told aloud, sometimes only silence filled the room. The flicker of fire, the smell of smoke, the creak of wooden benches, these were the companions of a knight's night. And then, sleep. The castle grew quiet. Torches burned low, and knights retired to their beds. Outside, the wind moved across the walls. Dogs howled in the distance. The moon cast pale light through arrow-slit windows. Another day ended, not with adventure, but with routine. This was the daily life of a knight. Repetition, duty, prayer, service, training, waiting, eating simple meals, sleeping in simple rooms, rising again with the bell of dawn. It may sound plain, even boring, and that is because it was. For all the legends, for all the stories told in later centuries, the true life of most knights was a life of routine. Only rarely did battle or glory break the pattern. Most of the time, it was steady, quiet, and uneventful. As you imagine this, perhaps you can see the castle courtyard, the clang of a wooden sword against a post, the sound of horses stamping in their stalls, the murmur of prayers in the chapel, the flicker of torches in stone halls, and then the stillness of night returning again. This, in its calmness, in its slowness, is where we pause. For the life of a knight, like the rhythm of sleep, was built on steady repetition. And it is in that steady rhythm, plain and uneventful, that rest comes most easily.
When most people today imagine a knight, they picture shining armor, tall horses, and glorious battles under the sun. But the truth, as with much else in a knight's life, was far less glamorous and often very heavy. Let us begin with the armor. A knight's armor was not something he simply put on in the morning like a shirt. No, it was a process, slow and tiring. First came the padded undergarments, thick layers of linen and wool that were meant to soften the weight of the steel. Then, piece by piece, the armor was strapped on, the greaves for the legs, the breastplate, the gauntlets for the hands, and finally, the heavy helmet. It could take nearly an hour to fully prepare a knight for war, and even longer to remove the pieces afterward. And once inside, the knight was not free. He was stiff, hot, and sometimes barely able to breathe. The polished steel might look beautiful in tapestries or stories, but to wear it for hours under the sun was exhausting. The armor alone could weigh 40 to 60 pounds, and that was in addition to the shield and sword. Knights were trained to endure it, yes, but even the strongest among them would sweat, stumble, and tire. Imagine trying to climb stairs or sit on a horse with that weight pressing down on your shoulders. It was not heroic, it was simply tiring. And then there was the horse,
A knight without his horse was considered incomplete. The war horse, called a destrier, was expensive, far more costly than most peasants would earn in a lifetime. These horses were trained for years, carefully fed and groomed, kept in stables with hay and oats, and protected with almost as much care as the knight himself. But a destrier was not always available. Many knights rode ordinary horses on patrols or during daily duties, saving their great war horses for tournaments or battle. And like the knight, the horse too had armor, mail over its chest, plates covering its head, all heavy, all costly, all uncomfortable. Taking care of a horse was a full-time task. Squires brushed its coat, cleaned its hooves, carried buckets of water, and mucked the stalls. And if the horse fell ill, the knight might be helpless, for without a strong horse, his status and usefulness would quickly fade. Weapons, too, required endless care. The sword was not always sharp and shining. It had to be cleaned, oiled, and sharpened on a whetstone. Rust was the enemy. Rain could ruin a blade, and mud could eat at the edges. A careless knight who neglected his sword or his armor would soon find himself mocked by others, or worse, defenseless.
And then there was the cost. Knights were not wealthy men by default. Many were minor nobles with little land, and the expenses of armor, horses, weapons, and servants could be crushing. A single set of armor might cost as much as a small house. And if a knight was unlucky enough to have his armor damaged in battle, he might need years to repair or replace it. Knighthood, then, was not the shining adventure that stories tell us. It was a burden, one of iron and sweat. A knight was often more prisoner to his armor and his horse than master of them. Even tournaments, which today are remembered as grand festivals of color and excitement, were exhausting. A knight would spend hours preparing, baking in the sun under steel plates, charging again and again with a heavy lance that might shatter on impact. And if he fell, it was not always glorious. Sometimes bones broke. Sometimes men did not rise again. By evening, the knight returned not as a hero, but as a tired man, his body aching, his armor dented, his horse in need of rest. He would sit at a wooden table, eat simple food, and feel the soreness in his shoulders. Yes, the life of armor and horses was heavy indeed, heavy in cost, heavy in weight, heavy in labor. Far from the glitter of fairy tales, it was slow, tiring, and never-ending. And yet it was this weight, this burden, that defined the knight. Not his victories, not his songs, not his shining armor and paintings, but the long, quiet struggle against discomfort, against expense, against the endless work of keeping steel polished and horses alive. So if you ever imagine the life of a medieval knight, do not think of shining armor and noble steeds beneath banners of silk. Instead, imagine the slow, tiring process of fastening straps, the groan of a man bending under the weight of iron, and the steady plodding of hooves across muddy fields. For this was the truth of knighthood, not the cool version, but the real, boring one. By the late Middle Ages, the knight was no longer what he had once been. Gunpowder had arrived. Cannons roared against castle walls.
breaking stone in ways no sword or lance ever could. Muskets fired from afar, piercing armor that had once seemed unbreakable. The knight, with his sword and shield, began to look less like the future of warfare and more like the past. Armor, too, had grown heavier, trying to resist the force of bullets. By the 15th century, some knights wore suits so heavy they could barely move without help. And yet, even the thickest steel could not stop a musket ball. What had once been protection now became a burden, and what had once been honor now became impractical. The cost of knighthood remained high. Horses, armor, weapons, all still drained fortunes. But kings no longer needed knights the way they once had. They needed large armies of soldiers, men with pikes and muskets, who could be trained quickly and cheaply. The knight, with all his training and expense, had become unnecessary. Slowly, the image of the knight shifted. He was no longer the backbone of armies. Instead, he became a symbol, a story, a memory. Knights still existed, but their role was now more ceremonial than practical. They appeared at tournaments, they guarded kings at parades, they stood for honor and tradition. But their daily lives were not glorious. Many knights faded into obscurity, struggling to maintain their expensive equipment, struggling to hold on to land that no longer yielded enough wealth. Some became mercenaries, selling their swords to the highest bidder. Others retired quietly, their armor rusting in storage, their horses sold, their names forgotten. And yet, their stories remained. Writers and poets, centuries later, would sing of their bravery, polishing their image until it gleamed brighter than any steel. Knights became the heroes of romances, rescuers of maidens, defenders of honor. In reality, their lives had been hard, tiring, and often dull. But in stories, they became something greater. And perhaps that is why the legend of the knight has survived long after the real men have vanished. Because stories do not remember the sweat beneath the armor. They do not tell of the aching shoulders, the heavy steps, the endless expense of keeping a horse fed. Stories remember shining steel, noble hearts, and victories in tournaments. Tonight, as we close our tale, imagine not the knight of fairy tales, but the quiet truth. A man sitting by a wooden fire, his armor stacked in a corner, his horse tied outside in the cold night air. His body is sore, his hands rough, his life unremarkable. He is not a hero of legend, not a figure of glory. He is simply a man, heavy with the burdens of his station, living a life that was far more ordinary than we are taught to believe. And in that ordinariness lies the real story of the medieval knight. Not the glorious one, but the boring one.